From DocuSign, consent required, individual consent. I'm Larry Kluger, a lead product manager on the DocuSign developer team. DocuSign supports 3 different OAuth flows for our APIs: Authorization Code Grant, JWT Grant, and Implicit Grant. See the show notes for links to a video and documentation about the OAuth authentication flows. To meet modern information security standards, an authorized person must provide consent before an application can act on behalf of or impersonate a user. Application consent is tracked by DocuSign. It is not stored in a cookie or elsewhere on the browser. The authorization code and implicit grant flows smoothly handle the consent step when the user authenticates with the application for the first time. This is called Inband Consent, since it occurs within the application flow. Inband Consent is not available for the JWT Grant, since the JWT Grant is used by autonomous applications where a user is often not present. For JWT Grant, an out-of-band consent step is needed. Because in-band consent is more convenient, DocuSign recommends that independent software vendors, ISVs, use Authorization Code Grant whenever possible. DocuSign supports 3 options for JWT out-of-band consent: administrative consent, individual consent, and ISV administrative consent. This video discusses individual consent for the JWT Grant. ISV administrative consent is required if an ISV application whose integration key is managed by the ISV is configured to use administrative consent for users on your account. Many ISVs use individual consent, which can always be used since it can be used by any DocuSign customer with any type of account. If you receive the consent required error, well, the first thing is congratulations. Receiving this error when you're using the OAuth JWT Grant flow indicates that your application is creating the JWT request correctly. That covers a lot of software territory. Next, you just need to obtain consent for the user your application is impersonating, and you'll be ready to make API calls. Individual consent is the lowest common denominator JWT consent flow. It can be used for any JWT scenario. To use individual consent, the account user who will be impersonated via the JWT authentication flow must log in to the DocuSign web app. For system accounts, such as finance@example.com, you must have access to the user account's email and the DocuSign password for the account. You should also prepare a suitable thank you page that will be shown to your application's users after they have granted consent. I'll discuss an example thank you page later on in this video. Now let's look inside the individual consent process. It's important to realize that the individual consent process is actually the first part of the authorization code grant flow, but we'll end the flow early. Here's how it works. Step 1. The user granting consent opens a URL from their browser. The URL is also called the consent URL. The URL is a request to the DocuSign OAuth service provider, either account.docusign.com or account-d.docusign.com. The consent URL includes the application's clientId, the integration key, the redirect URL for the application, and the application scopes. Step 2. DocuSign will respond with the login page. Step 3. The user and DocuSign will go back and forth with requests and responses for the password, perhaps for SSO information, etc. At the end of Step 3, the user has authenticated with DocuSign. Next, in Step 4, DocuSign will ask the user to grant consent for any of the requested scopes that the user has not previously consented to for this client ID. The name of the application will be shown along with a brief description of the requested scopes. We'll see an example during the demonstration. The user grants consent by clicking on the consent form. At this point we're done. The user has granted consent. Let's see what happens next. After the user grants consent, we reach Step 5. In this step, DocuSign will redirect the user's browser to the previously requested redirect URL. Up until this point, everything I've discussed is the exact same for either an authorization code grant request or an individual JWT consent request. Exactly the same. In Step 6, we make a change. For an authorization code grant flow, the next step would be for the application to receive an authorization code and then exchange the authorization code for an access token. Instead, for granting consent, we will redirect the user's browser to a thank you page. Note that the redirect to the thank you page will include an authorization code. The trick is that we will simply ignore the authorization code since we don't need it. We just need to show the user a thank you page and ask them to close the browser tab since they've completed the individual consent process. In summary, the individual consent is the exact same as the authorization code grant flow, except the redirect URL is for consent thank you page, not for your application. The consent thank you page displays thank you, please close this browser tab. And lastly, the authorization code sent to the thank you page is discarded. There are 5 steps for using individual consent. Set up your consent thank you page, set up your client ID, your integration key, create your individual consent URL, decide how to distribute the consent URL, and testing. Step 1. Set up your consent thank you page. The thank you page must be accessible from your user's browsers. It does not need to be on the public internet. The consent thank you page is not an application. It is a simple HTML page. Highly recommended. Include JavaScript on the page to erase the authorization code from the displayed URL. There's no need for the person to see the authorization code. Hiding it can eliminate a source of confusion and questions. We've published a generic consent thank you page that you can use directly or that you can use as an example for your own thank you page. Note the JavaScript in the example thank you page that hides the authorization code and related query parameters. The URLs for the example consent thank you page and its source are included in the show notes. Step 2. Set up your client ID. That's your integration key. Remember that the DocuSign term integration key means the exact same thing as the OAuth term client ID. To use an integration key for JWT Grant authentication with individual consent, it needs specific settings. In particular, it is important to disable implicit grant, since implicit grant enables a client ID to be used without a secret key or RSA key pair. You will also set the URL of your consent thank you page as a redirect URI for the client ID. Step 3. Create your individual consent URL. Decide which API scopes your application will need and then concatenate them with %20 as the separator. The JWT Grant always needs the impersonation scope at a minimum. The next part of the slide shows the consent URL format with the substitution fields and curly braces. Create your consent URL carefully from the example. All parts of the URL are needed, including the response type query parameter. I've included the consent URL format and example with the show notes. The slide also shows an example consent URL after substituting values for the fields. The redirect URI can be URL encoded and must be encoded if it includes any ampersands or question mark characters. Step 4. Decide how to distribute the consent URL. Because JWT consent is handled out of band, you must decide how you will distribute the individual consent URL. You have many options, including the following. You can publish the URL with your application's instructions. Your users just need to click the URL and follow the steps to grant consent as a one-time process. Your application can email the URL to your application's users. Depending on your application, you can provide the consent URL as part of an error message. If your application uses a system account such as finance@example.com, you just need to open the consent URL in your browser. Note that you'll need the authentication credentials for the system account. In most cases, you will also need access to the system account's email inbox. For example, if you use a system account named finance@example.com, then you will need to see any authentication-related emails that are sent to that email address while you're logging into the user account. Remember that the same consent URL is used by everyone who will be impersonated by your application's JWT Grant flow. The consent URL is not customized per person. Step 5. Test your work by configuring your application for a user in your account who has not previously granted consent. Confirm that your application receives a consent required error. Ask the user to open the consent URL and complete the consent flow. They will need their DocuSign login credentials. Test that now the JWT Grant succeeds. Here's a demonstration. First, we'll test a command line application that uses a JWT Grant. The JWT Grant flow fails with the consent required error message. In this example, the application provides the consent URL. Now let's use individual consent to grant consent to the integration key. And here's the consent form where we grant consent. Now back to the command line application. This time the JWT Grant succeeds since consent has been given. Some notes about individual consent. The person authenticating with DocuSign to grant individual consent must be the same DocuSign user who will be impersonated by the JWT Grant flow. Remember to check your spelling and know which scopes are required for your API usage. Individual consent can be used alongside administrative consent. The consent may take 2 to 5 minutes to propagate within the DocuSign system. The same individual consent URL is used by all the application's users. That's it. Thank you for developing with DocuSign. Remember to check the show notes for the documentation links.